We're moving into the reproductive system. Of course, the system allows us to create new life. And that's what we see here as the functions, of course. There's production of a unique type of cell known as a gamete. They're also known as reproductive cells, sex cells. The gametes are cells that only have half of that person's genome, half of their genetics. So, of course, half from the male, half from the female. And the fusion of those gametes allows for the development of a new human life. There's also a number of hormones that are produced by reproductive organs. So the overlap with the endocrine system, these hormone producing structures, as well as production of gametes. So again, with the male and female sex cells produced, spermatozoa and the ova, there's the union of the sperm and the egg, the fertilization. So ultimately looking at the two sexes, the male anatomy is designed for production of sperm, of course, production of the male gamete, and then there's the structures involved in the delivery of sperm ultimately into the female reproductive system. Whereas the female anatomy, there's the development of the ova, the term for the egg, the ova, and the process of fertilization, the union and fusion of the two gametes, taking place naturally within the female body, and with that fertilized egg now being developed internally inside of the female system. So we're going to start with the male anatomy. And starting here, just inferior to the area of the pelvic cavity, there's now this pouch of skin known as a scrotum. And the scrotum itself descending down from the pelvic cavity, containing internally the location of the testes within what's known as the scrotal cavities. So the paired testes there in the scrotum. And this position, this anatomy, is key in terms of male fertility. So deep to the skin of the scrotum, there's a layer of muscle, and in particular one of them known as the cremaster muscle. This muscle will now contract or relax to either elevate the position of the scrotum and testis or depress to lower. And it's really controlling the distance between the testis and the pelvic cavity. And the need for this location is so that the testes, which is developing sperm, can be about 1 degree cooler than the average body temperature. And that temperature difference, that 1 degree cooler temperature difference, is vital for the creation of sperm cells. And the cremaster muscle can now regulate the position and thus the temperature. Internally now within a testis, there's now these multiple lobules, these coiled sections, and all of these coiled sections together make up what's called a seminiferous tubule. And you can see there's a large degree of coiling, there's a large degree of length to the seminiferous tubule, and this is the exact spot for the creation of sperm all along the length of these seminiferous tubules. And you can see that per testis, there's about a half mile per testis, or in a pair, a mile of tubing. So starting at puberty, once the male reaches puberty, the stem cells, they begin now to differentiate, and all along the length of the seminiferous tubules, this now leads to sperm production. At first, it starts slowly, but over time, as a male matures and ages, it increases. An adult man can produce about 500 million sperm cells on a daily basis. And the need for such a high creation, a high rate of creation, is necessary to fertilize an egg. And we'll see near the end of this section, it's about a few million, about 10, 20 million sperm cells that are necessary to fertilize an egg. And there's that very high synthesis rate for that reason. And just a closer look. So we have what's known as a spermatogonium, that term there for a stem cell. And ultimately, after puberty, these cells become active and ultimately start to differentiate into forming mature spermatozoa. And this is occurring in the wall of the seminiferous tubule. So still more reproductive hormones, and again, a lot of overlap with the endocrine system here. Looking back at the brain itself, the pituitary gland, the source of both follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And we see each of these, in a way, leads to increased sperm production, either that direct effect of FSH to support sperm production, increased levels of sperm production, and luteinizing hormone indirectly does the same thing. The direct action of LH is to stimulate interstitial cells. These interstitial cells are found surrounding these seminiferous tubules. And in response, interstitial cells produce testosterone. And one of the many effects of testosterone is to stimulate production of sperm, amongst other functions. So this final slide, and then we'll move to a diagram to explain all of this. We just pointed out the interstitial cells are producing testosterone. Testosterone, as we just mentioned, of course, stimulates increased levels of sperm production. So at puberty, especially when testosterone levels rise, this will start the process of spermiogenesis and spermatogenesis. But also, it stimulates multiple structures and organs all around the body. So in particular with the reproductive system, it'll stimulate a number of the accessory glands of the male reproductive system, so such as the prostate function, for example. And as I mentioned, we have all of the various organ systems. So we want to think about the bone growth, the bone lengthening, density of bone, muscle mass, body fat distribution, intermediate hair growth, many examples. The thyroid, cartilage growth, many examples of the testosterone affects what's known as secondary sexual characteristics. These would be adult masculine traits. So again, hormones in this case influencing multiple organ systems. So to view all of this hormonal activity, we could sum it up right here. Multiple hormones that stimulate sperm production and creation of sperm in the very high numbers is vital for a male's fertility. And inhibin, of course, is a level of regulation. So why is there only 500 million sperm cells produced daily? There is a level of regulation. And we can see that all here. So we notice starting at the pituitary is what we're interested in. The source of LH and FSH. And we have the key for the names down here. You also notice the arrows means that it's stimulating, increasing, upregulating something. And the blue line there is showing that it's blocking, it's inhibiting something. So FSH, circulating from the brain, hormones traveling through the bloodstream to reach the testes. And there's the seminiferous tubules, the site where sperm cells are created, the site where the sustentacular or the nerve cells are located. And with the blood-brain barrier function, they're aiding in that production of sperm cells. So ultimately, we see that's the effect of FSH. Also, nerve cells, a source of inhibin, so feeding back on the brain to, of course, decrease its production. So it's regulating the amount of sperm cells produced, not allowing it to go too high by having that negative feedback loop. And over here, LH, again, circulating to the testes, but here having its direct action on those surrounding interstitial cells. Interstitial cells surround the seminiferous tubules, source of testosterone, and again, affecting the the glandular function of the reproductive organs, affecting the masculine traits of the adult body, affecting multiple organ systems. So a nice summary chart for the male reproductive system. And just going back, you notice how the spermatogonia, the cells that have been there from birth, they're outside of the blood testis barrier. They don't need that protection because these cells have been there from the beginning. But now, as they divide and they develop into unique types of cells, that's where the nurse cells or the sustentacular cells are maintaining that blood testis barrier. So now these new unique type of cells are protected from our immunity. So at this point, we'll now follow the pathway from the source of sperm cell production. We'll start from the seminal tubules, and we're now just going to follow the pathway ultimately so that these sperm cells can exit out of the body. And that's their unique function. Sperm cells are designed for transport, and their function is to deliver, of course, that haploid DNA. And this is a cell that's designed to completely exit out of the male body. And along the way, along the pathway, there's a number of organs that are producing secretions. The prostate I gave as an example earlier. And the sperm cells will now mix with these secretions, each which has a various purpose. And that leads to the production of semen. Semen is a combination of the secretions and the sperm cells. So as sperm leaves out of the testis, the next organ in the pathway right here is this arch known as the epididymis. And this serves as a temporary storage site for those rapidly produced sperm cells. So again, they're created at a very fast rate. And as they pass out of the testis, they're pushed along via cilia. And at this stage, the sperm cells are formed. They have their shape, but they're inactive. Any abnormal, faulty sperm cells will be broken down in the area of the epididymis. And the tail of the epididymis leads right into the ductus deferens, commonly called vas deferens. And this serves as a long-term storage site for sperm cells, possibly, or otherwise, sperm cells are then pushed along the ductus deferens via peristalsis and pushing them along to the area of the urethra. And here we're seeing that dual purpose function of the male urethra, previously, of course, for the urinary system. The urinary bladder excretes urine directly to the urethra. And now we're seeing the pathway for sperm and seminal fluids for semen to be excreted out of the urethra. So it's this dual purpose function for the male urethra. So we already mentioned along the pathway now as sperm cells travel out, as they travel along the urethra specifically, that's where we find a number of these glands, seminal glands, prostate gland, bulbourethral glands. And seminal glands or seminal vesicles, they could be called either name. They're in a pair, and so are the bulbourethral glands. They're also in a pair. So these glands all produce fluid secretions. And again, the term semen, it's a combination of sperm cells and the glandular secretions together, making that component of semen. These glands are stimulated by testosterone, but their function is greatly increased by signaling of the visceral motor, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. Greatly increases their levels of secretion. So collectively, all of these secretions now allow for the sperm cell to become fully active. So prior to this point, The sperm cells are formed anatomically. However, they're getting pushed along via cilia or via peristalsis. It's not until they mix with the secretions does the sperm cell truly become independent, and it can now move the flagella, so the long tail structure. So now with the active flagella, the sperm cell can now start to propel itself through the fluids. Again, this is a cell that's designed to exit out of the male body and pass into the female reproductive tract for fertilization. So as the cell leaves the body, these fluids provide an energy source so that the cells can continue their metabolism and continue to function, as well as protecting the sperm cells as they pass through the urethra. So any possible residue of urinary material, which is acidic, that lower pH, the secretions here from some of these glands are more alkaline to help counteract any residual urine in the urethra, as well as especially to protect women from infection. The vaginal canal has a lower pH to protect women from bacterial infection, but that would cause a complication for the sperm cell. So in order to overcome that, again, these pH buffers that are in the seminal fluids will protect the sperm cells when they travel through this slightly acidic environment. So individually, we'll take a look at the glands. So starting with the paired seminal glands, just making up, you notice here, a larger proportion of the fluid. And this is the energy source. As the sperm cells exit out of the male body, and the sperm cells can survive within the female reproductive tract for a few days. So we mentioned a pH buffer, so it's slightly on the higher end of the pH scale, more alkaline or more basic, in order to counteract the acidic environment the sperm cells are exposed to. And we see that the seminal glands themselves, they excrete their fluid directly into the prostate, and two canals that run through the prostate are the paired ejaculatory ducts. The sperm cells are being delivered along the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens merges with the seminal vesicles at the point of the ejaculatory ducts. And these are located inside of the prostate. And that's the next area. So the prostate gland itself, again, a source of seminal fluid, and in particular, it's the source of this material known as seminal plasm. And seminal plasm, it acts to kill bacteria. It functions as a naturally produced antibiotic, fighting off bacteria. And this seminal plasm and the prostate gland as a whole releases its secretions into the first segment of the urethra. So with this production of fluid from the prostate gland and this seminal plasm in particular, this helps to protect the urethra from, of course, infection. So the urethra and all the way back to the urinary bladder has this protection. And the final gland, the paired bulbourethral glands, or another name is Cowper. Spell that out. So the Cowper's glands, get the apostrophe in there. There we go. So Cowper's glands or bulbourethral glands, we notice again a pH buffer, and also this secretion released into the urethra, excreted out of the urethra. It functions as a natural lubricant for the penis as a whole. So ultimately, with the contribution of sperm cells from the ductus deferens and all of these glands making up a portion of secretion, the fluid secretion plus the sperm cells make the term semen, and this is now excreted out of the male body. We're starting the female reproductive system. So taking a look here now, the female gonad, the ovaries, have an internal position within, we notice here now, the pelvic cavity. So the uterus, fallopian tubes as well, all held in place in the pelvic cavity by multiple ligaments. So the various suspensory and round and ovarian ligaments, broad ligaments, multiple ligaments are holding the female anatomy within the pelvic cavity, with, of course, some areas of external genitalia as well. So taking a look at the female gonad, the ovary, and this is the location for the development and maturation of the female egg. It's known as the ova. In comparison to male development, women are now born with a few million eggs already produced before birth, clustered together. So the majority of the mitosis, the creation of stem cells, has occurred before a woman's born. And now, over time, once a girl reaches her reproductive years, now the eggs that are already produced start to develop their follicle structures. And ultimately, at the stage of a mature follicle, the ova is now released out for possible fertilization. So what's known as oogenesis, as I mentioned, the creation of the cells has occurred largely before birth. So they're stored within the ovary. Once the girl now reaches her reproductive age, now there's, of course, the differentiation of the stem cell that now starts to divide its chromosomes. So through that process of meiosis, once again, to produce a haploid cell. And we notice here now, this is a very large, the largest size human cell produced is the female egg, the ovum. So this haploid cell, once released out of the ovary, could be possibly fertilized by a sperm cell, bringing those two haploid sets of genes together. Many of the ova that's produced, however, only about 400,000 of them are still present in the body by the time a girl reaches her reproductive years. So a number of eggs are just simply degraded within the ovaries and never released. And of the 400,000, about 500 actually undergo the process of ovulation, being released out of the ovary for possible fertilization. So a major difference here between men and women. Males are not producing any gametes until after puberty, whereas in women, they've been produced largely before birth. Men have an equal division of the cells to make multiple spermatids, whereas here there's this unequal division leading to this very, very large, as I mentioned, the largest size human cell is this female ova, an unfertilized egg. And again, the numbers. After puberty, men are producing, of course, 500 million sperm cells daily. So over a lifetime, a huge number of sperm cells for men, whereas women is more limited. The numbers that are still present by the time a woman reaches puberty, and the relatively small number that are ever released out of the ovary. So that leads us in the description of what's called the ovarian cycle, events that occur within the ovary to allow for this development. So we're going to start with what's called a follicle structure. It has, of course, the egg cell that's still in an immature state, what's known as an oocyte, and the surrounding follicle cells, generally making a shape kind of like so. If you got the oocyte, and then the bordering cells on the edge, the follicle cells, and the entire thing is one follicle. Well, within the follicle, the bordering cells are giving nourishment to that still maturing oocyte, and we'll work through the stages that occur within. So starting with the eggs that are produced before birth, what's known as the primordial follicles, and the egg nest, each cycle, each month, a number of these primordial follicles will develop and enlarge to make a few of these primary follicles. We can see two here. And what I was trying to sketch, you notice the oocyte in the center and the surrounding bordering cells on the edge. So now a few of these develop into a secondary follicle stage. So it's enlarging. And per cycle, per month, there's usually only one mature follicle that grows. And there's multiple names: tertiary follicle, Graafian follicle, mature follicle. And we notice now it takes on this distinct shape here. It's much bigger if you notice the magnification. And it has this distinct crescent-shaped area within known as the antrum. It's a trait of a mature follicle. And it's at this point the oocyte is now ready for ovulation to be released out of the ovary. And that's the next step, ovulation. So the egg cell is now released from the ovary, picked up by the uterine tubes. And now there's the variation. The remaining structure of the follicle transitions into what's called a corpus luteum and becomes a source of hormones. In all cases, however, the corpus luteum is a temporary structure and it will be degraded. If the egg that's released becomes fertilized, the corpus luteum will persist for a longer amount of time, but it still will be broken down ultimately. If there's no fertilization, no pregnancy, corpus luteum again is broken down just at a faster pace, and that'll trigger a new cycle. The breakdown of the corpus luteum, and that'll lead to, of course, a new cycle, starting with the primordial follicles developing into primary, secondary, tertiary, leading to another stage of ovulation. If there is a fertilized egg, if there is a pregnancy, hormones will suppress the triggering of a new cycle. And just seen here on the illustration. So again, starting with the nest, forming the primary, secondary, and mature follicle stage, now primed for ovulation, and the transition from the remaining bordering cells forming that hormone-producing corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum, again, is a temporary feature that will be degraded and lead to the start of a new cycle. And this will continue until the number of eggs are depleted. So now at that same time, and we'll have a comparison from the ovarian cycle, there's the changes in the uterus. And the uterus has three layers: a perimetrium, a myometrium, and an endometrium. And the internal endometrium is the layer that's affected by the uterine cycle. So not these other two. So during menses, the endometrium is all but destroyed. Just the very basal deep layer of the endometrium remains intact. All the functional layer is broken down as the blood supply is reduced, leading to the damage and death of the tissue ultimately. And as the tissue detaches from the uterus, it sheds. The blood from the blood vessels, the tissue of the endometrium itself is all shed during a period of menses. So now after the breakdown of the blood vessels and endometrium in menses, the next two phases of the cycle is now a repair phase, so a regeneration of the tissue. And that's exactly the description now for proliferative phase. So regenerating the tissue of the endometrium, redeveloping those blood vessels. So building back the tissue lining. And this continues into secretory phase, where ultimately all of the glandular structures, which are numerous throughout the endometrium, they're called endometrial glands. They're now developed, and at this point, leading to the full thickness build of the endometrium. At this point, the uterus is now ready to support a pregnancy, and it would be right around this time is where egg would undergo ovulation out of the ovary to possibly be fertilized and now implant in this developed endometrium. But if there's no pregnancy, that'll lead to another period of menses and start the uterine cycle over again. And we can see that visually here. So very little remains of the endometrium from menses. As I mentioned, just that deep basilar layer. And with secretory phase, the regrowth of the tissue and building back its full thickness in the secretory phase. Taking a look at the hormonal section, and similar to the male section, there'll be a chart. So again, from the brain, from the pituitary gland, FSH, LH, now we're pointing out prolactin. So follicle stimulating hormone in the female body, the effect, of course, is leading to the growth of the follicle stages and thus the maturation of the oocyte. So that still maturing female gamete maturing in the follicle structure. So as it transitions from the primary, secondary, tertiary stages, the beginning of the cycle has higher levels of FSH to stimulate that. LH, there's a sharp rise in the level of LH levels, and that stimulates the release of the egg out of the follicle, out of the ovary. So that term ovulation. And the remaining cells of the follicle create the corpus luteum. And we'll see that spike in LH. And whereas prolactin, stimulating the breast structure, the mammary gland structure, for the production of breast milk to nourish now a baby, allowing for breastfeeding. Estrogens, of course, produced in the ovaries. Let me go back to that. This would be the counterpart to male testosterone. So not only does it affect the function of the reproductive organs, but again, the entire female adult body. So again, all the organ systems, so hair and skin and the brain, the nervous system, the bone structures, the muscular system, all being influenced by, of course, these traits of estrogen that'll feminize the adult body. And we'll also see a rise in estrogen levels after menses. Menses is where the endometrium, of course, is being broken down. And the rising levels of estrogens leads to that proliferative phase, the repair and growth of the tissue. And similar to the male section, we'll organize all of the hormonal portions on a single chart. So then lastly, the corpus luteum formed after ovulation, a source of hormones, and in particular here progesterone. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is the initial source of progesterone. If there's a pregnancy, the placenta itself, the placenta for the developing baby, becomes a source of progesterone. But in both cases, progesterone helps to maintain the development of the endometrium. So really priming the uterus and especially the endometrium to carry that pregnancy to term and to suppress a new cycle of menses. So there could be the continued growth within the uterus. So all of this section here is seen on a diagram from our textbook, and we'll go through this again. So from the pituitary gland, specifically that adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary, you notice in the first half of the cycle, there's higher levels of FSH that are stimulating the follicle stages. So in the ovaries, there's the effect for the development of the follicle stages. There's now the levels of luteinizing hormone in a sharp rise. And shortly thereafter, that's what triggers ovulation, release of the egg out of the ovary, and the remaining cells of the follicle form the corpus luteum, which in turn leads to the rise in progesterone levels. Looking at hormones produced in the ovaries themselves, so we notice after menses, in the uterine cycle, after there's the breakdown of the endometrium for the most part, estrogens are produced, and that leads to the rising levels of estrogens, of course, but the result is the regrowth of the endometrium, so that proliferative phase, rebuilding the tissue. So with the development of the endometrium in secretory phase, the corpus luteum, or the placenta, being a source of progesterone, that helps to maintain the development of the endometrium. And if there's no pregnancy, there's no placenta, of course, the corpus luteum is broken down. That leads to a drop in progesterone levels. That decline in progesterone levels is what ultimately triggers a new cycle of menses in the uterus. So this is a really great figure here, explaining multiple parts, and you could go back to rewind any of that if you need to hear this again.
That's all, folks.